Well, here we are in week 3 of our spiritual conversations journey. And this week, we really get into the heart of what this is all about. Because really what it's all about is learning how we can respond naturally and effectively and fruitfully in spiritual conversations with anyone at really any time. So how do we even get started? I know for some, this question is really the barrier for even having more spiritual conversations. When we surveyed the PCTR back in the spring about your experience with these types of conversations, we heard from 58% of you that perhaps the biggest barrier for you having spiritual conversations is just you don't know what to say. Paul gives us an incredible model for spiritual conversations. And what we learn is it begins with not so much what we have to say, but listening and listening well. You just discussed 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where Paul talks about finding common ground with everyone so that he can save some. Well, how do you find common ground with anyone? Well, you have to listen. You may need to ask some questions and start to get to know them, but you have to hear from them to get an understanding of where they are before we can meet them on that common ground. Then we can respond. We can respond graciously, we can respond confidently, and we can respond more effectively when we meet them where they are. That'll be so much more helpful for them on their spiritual journey. Remember, just like you and me, every person that you encounter, every person in your life is on their own spiritual journey. God is part of their life. God is guiding them. God is at work in ways that we maybe can't see, maybe they can't see. But God wants to work through us to meet them where they are, to gain a hearing, and we can be those who share His love. Lutheran Hour Ministries has developed a really incredible tool called the Spiritual Conversation Curve. And this tool can really help us recognize where people are so that we can meet them there and then respond graciously and effectively. Here are Blythe Barreto and Chris Mackey from Lutheran Hour Ministries to explain the Spiritual Conversation Curve.
So this lesson is all about being there for others, meeting others where they are on their spiritual journeys, coming alongside of them and talking to them in ways that are helpful to them. So we have developed a simple model called the Spiritual Conversations Curve. And this model equips students to have the kind of heart and skills to be this kind of friend.
Yeah, and we've already acknowledged that we're all on our own unique spiritual journeys. But after talking with thousands of people who at one time were not Christians and then became Christians, we learned that there are basically 3 common, what we're calling postures toward the gospel. Some people are pretty far from faith in Jesus for whatever reason. These friends we might think of as unreceptive to the gospel. That's the word we're using for that posture.
So this would be like my friend Beth. She's always posting negative things about Christians on Instagram. But yet she's not at all interested in hearing a different perspective. Whenever religion seems to come up, she's either hostile or completely uninterested. Then there are my friends who aren't unreceptive, hardcore like Beth, but they aren't actively pursuing God either. They're somewhere in the middle. Like they might go to my church Cinco de Mayo bingo event, and they're not going to necessarily roll their eyes when I say that I have Bible study, but they aren't going out of their way to research Christian beliefs. They're not really asking me about my faith unless I bring it up first. And we'll say that these people are receptive to the gospel.
Right, receptive. I've had a lot of conversations with others who are not Christians, but because of something they heard, it kind of piqued their interest, or they have a friend that they respect who's a Christian, or they might have actually gone to youth group or to church and they heard something that they're curious about. They're asking questions, they're kind of leaning in. And this posture, we say they're seeking because they're interested, they're curious, they want to know more.
So how is this helpful? Well, 2 things. First, it shows that not every non-Christian is the same. This is not a one-size-fits-all mold. Some people can be really closed off, some can be open, and others are actually actively seeking answers. So what we shouldn't do is assume anything about our non-Christian friends. Instead, we should learn to listen and to recognize where they are on their spiritual journey.
Yeah. And the second way the curve helps is it helps us to understand where they are in their spiritual journey so we can adapt our conversation to where they are. We shouldn't have a predetermined agenda going into every conversation with non-Christian friends. No, we meet them where they are in their spiritual journey and we adapt so that we can be helpful to them.
Yeah, Chris mentioned this predetermined agenda. And as we learn about the curve, it's important to know that this is not like a step-by-step process or some sort of formula. Remember our purpose. It's to regularly and naturally have gracious spiritual conversations with non-Christians. Not to walk around with an agenda, but instead we just genuinely want to love God by loving others. No strings attached.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's put these together. We want to become the kind of people who recognize where someone is on their spiritual journey and who, in the moment, responds graciously by adapting to their needs. We want to recognize and respond. The rest of the spiritual conversation curve is designed to equip you to recognize where someone is on their spiritual journey and then give you the tools to respond graciously, meeting them where they are.
And if we can learn to recognize where they are on their spiritual journey, unreceptive, receptive, or seeking, then we can respond graciously and confidently by adapting to our friends.
Exactly. If you recognize that someone is unreceptive, for instance, something we'll learn to do in the next lesson, then the curve helps us by showing that a gracious response is what we're calling chatting and relating conversations.
Yeah, and that meets them where they are on their spiritual journey. And for our receptive friends, a gracious response is to share about your own faith and connect your faith to everyday life.
Exactly. That's a gracious response. And if we recognize that someone is seeking, then a gracious response is to explore faith together and clarify the gospel as best we can.
So the rest of this unit is designed to equip you to recognize these three, what we've called spiritual postures, and then to respond graciously to each. And I promise we'll have a lot more fun, less of us jabbering at you. We'll have a lot more interaction with your friends. It'll be great.
Yep, this lesson is just an introduction to the spiritual conversation curve. But there's one last piece to the curve that is really helpful to keep in mind. It's the top of the curve. These are ways that God may be at work while you're having these different conversations.
Yeah, and that is so key to remember, that God is the one who is doing the hard work, not us. He's working on our friends' hearts and minds wherever they are on their spiritual journeys, while we're just the ones who are talking with them. For instance, in a chatting and relating conversation, God is at work helping you to gain a hearing. And that's just a fancy way of saying that God is building a trusting friendship between the two of you.
Yeah. It's fancy because it starts with G, and we like alliteration. It's a little easier to remember. So what is God up to when we're sharing and connecting with our receptive friends? He's using us to give our friends good news that faith is personal and connects to our everyday lives.
Yeah, that is so important, Chris. And when we are talking with our seeking friends, by exploring and clarifying, we can say that God is using us to guide them towards faith.
Today is just about introducing the spiritual conversation curve. Hope that you can become familiar with it, learn its parts, how it fits together, and then in the coming weeks, we'll learn how to use it and put it into practice to recognize where people are, to meet them there, and respond graciously and effectively.